What comes to mind when you hear the word slavery? Perhaps images of chained Africans being auctioned off in colonial America, or modern-day human trafficking networks that operate in the shadows. These are stories of brutality, inhumanity, and exploitation. So when critics claim that Islam promotes slavery and concubinage, it's no wonder people pause and ask questions. But what if I told you that this accusation is built on a misunderstanding, a failure to distinguish between two entirely different systems? Critics of Islam often use the word slavery to paint a picture of abuse and exploitation, but they conveniently ignore key distinctions. In a perfect Islamic society, the so-called slavery wouldn't resemble anything from history's most inhumane examples. In fact, it would be more humane than even some aspects of modern society. So today we'll explore how Islam's teachings redefine what we think of as slavery, how it's regulated, and how it compares to other systems throughout history. Let's begin. To appreciate the profound differences in Islamic teachings on this issue, we first need to examine what slavery has historically meant in other societies, starting with one of the most horrific examples, the Transatlantic slave trade. American slavery was defined by one thing: dehumanization. Millions of African men, women, and children were kidnapped, chained, and sold like livestock. Families were torn apart, never to be reunited. Whippings, branding, forced labor, involuntary breeding, and abuse were common, and enslaved individuals were legally considered property. The very foundation of this system rested on racism, a belief that black people were inherently inferior, justifying their exploitation for economic gain. They even made a humiliating name for them, a word that still is used to dehumanize black people today. There are several accurate movies about this horrific system which truly immerses you to the oppression that the slaves were going through at that time. And yet, even after abolition, slavery evolved. Today, human trafficking has replaced the plantations, with over 40 million people trapped in forced labor, sexual exploitation, or debt bondage worldwide. But how does this compare to what Islam teaches about slavery? To answer this, we need to break down what slavery means in Islam. In Islam, the concept of slavery is neither introduced nor celebrated. It was inherited from the societies of the time, where slavery was a universal norm. But unlike other systems, Islam's approach was designed to humanize and reform it, with the ultimate goal of phasing it out. So, what does slavery mean in Islam? Slavery, as permitted in Islamic teachings, refers to a system where individuals captured in war or born into slavery are brought into Muslim society. This wasn't about economic exploitation, nor was it a race-based system. Instead, these individuals were integrated into households where they were treated with dignity and given rights. The primary way people became slaves in an Islamic society was through war. Captives taken in battle could either be released, exchanged for ransom, or incorporated into Muslim households as slaves. This served a dual purpose, ensuring the captives weren't left to fend for themselves in destitution and allowing them to experience the Islamic way of life. Importantly, unlike in other societies, people were not enslaved through raids, forced abductions, or race-based exploitation. The treatment of slaves in Islam is where the system radically diverges from what we know of slavery in other cultures. The Quran and Hadith emphasize kindness, justice, and dignity for all individuals, including slaves. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, said, "Your slaves are your brothers whom Allah has put under your authority. So, whoever has a brother under his authority, let him feed him of what he eats and clothe him of what he wears. Do not burden them with tasks beyond their strength, and if you do so, then help them." Slaves were to be treated like members of the family with full access to food, clothing, and shelter of the same quality as their masters. Abuse or mistreatment was strictly forbidden, and any violation of these rights could result in serious consequences. Unlike in American slavery, where freedom was almost impossible to attain, Islam actively encouraged the liberation of slaves. Freeing a slave was considered one of the highest acts of charity. The Quran repeatedly mentions this. "And what can make you know what is breaking the difficult path? It is the freeing of a slave." Additionally, slaves could negotiate their freedom through contracts called mukataba, where they would pay their masters a sum over time to gain their liberty. Masters were obligated to agree to these contracts if the slave requested it. Furthermore, funds from Zakat were allocated specifically for purchasing the freedom of slaves, creating a societal framework to eliminate slavery. Let's put this into perspective. In American slavery, slaves were beaten beaten, starved, and stripped of their humanity. They were denied education, family connections, and freedom. In Islam, slaves were given rights, treated with dignity, and encouraged to seek their freedom. It wasn't just a difference in practice, it was a difference in philosophy. In a perfect Islamic society, the system of slavery functioned as a means of integrating individuals into a just and moral framework. Rather than exploiting them, it uplifted them. Islam's teaching sought to reform society by gradually phasing out oppressive practices rather than abruptly disrupting the social order. Now let's connect this to modern times. Isn't it ironic that critics of Islam accuse it of promoting slavery, yet we live in a world where sweatshops, trafficking, and economic exploitation are rampant? Before pointing fingers, perhaps the focus should be on addressing these present-day atrocities. Now let's address a term that's often misunderstood and weaponized against Islam: concubinage. Many critics hastily equate it to the abhorrent concept of sex slavery, imagining women in chains subjected to abuse. But such depictions couldn't be further from the truth. Let's unravel the facts, explore the context, and separate the misconceptions from reality. In Islamic law, concubinage refers to a specific circumstance in which female captives of war could be integrated into Muslim households. It's critical to understand the context of war during that time. Prisoners of war, both male and female, were a reality for all societies, and abandoning them after battle was not an option. Without support, they would likely face starvation, abuse, or even death. Islam, therefore, provided a structured system to incorporate female captives into society, ensuring their rights and welfare were protected. Unlike the enslavement practices of other cultures, these women were not kept in degrading conditions. Instead, they were treated with dignity and respect. They became part of the household, and the relationship between them and their master was governed by strict rules derived from the Quran and Hadith. The practice served both social and ethical purposes. It allowed captives to be integrated into Muslim society while maintaining the dignity of their position. Unlike common misconceptions, concubinage was not about exploitation, but about assimilation, security, and providing a stable future for those who would otherwise have none. It's worth noting that Islam explicitly prohibited the kind of abuse we associate with sex slavery. Any form of coercion, harm, or mistreatment was strictly forbidden. History also tells us of women who entered Muslim households as concubines and rose to positions of immense influence. Consider Shajar al-Dur, who became the Sultan of Egypt. Originally a concubine, her intelligence and leadership led her to rule one of the most powerful kingdoms of her time. Another prominent example is Roxolana, the wife of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. While she began her life as a concubine, she became one of the most influential figures in Ottoman history. These stories highlight that concubinage in Islam was far from the degrading stereotypes portrayed today. Islamic law also outlines clear guidelines for situations where a concubine bears a child. If a concubine gives birth to her master's child, she gains a special status known as al-Walad, mother of the child. From that point onward, she cannot be sold or transferred, and upon the master's death, she is automatically freed. The child is considered legitimate and holds the same rights as any other child in the family. This ruling, found in multiple hadiths and juristic interpretations, was revolutionary for its time. It ensured that concubinage did not create a class of illegitimate or marginalized individuals as seen in other historical contexts. Think about this for a moment. Doesn't this sound more humane than the way many societies treated marginalized women throughout history and even today? Contrast this with the plight of women trafficked into modern-day sex slavery, where they are subjected to unspeakable horrors with no protection, dignity, or hope for a better life. Islam's system, while rooted in its time, offered structure, security, and rights where none existed before. Now, let's take a step back and ask an important question. Why is Islam singled out for slavery and concubinage when these practices existed in nearly every major civilization and religious tradition? If critics are truly against these concepts, they should be equally critical of their own scriptures and histories. Yet somehow the focus always lands on Islam. Let's examine this double standard. Imagine someone accuses you of a crime while committing the same act themselves. Wouldn't that seem hypocritical? That's exactly what happens when people attack Islam while ignoring their own religious histories. For instance, the Bible explicitly explicitly discusses concubinage in multiple places. Numbers 31:17-18 recounts how Moses instructed his followers to keep young Midianite girls as captives. Exodus 21:7-11 allows the selling of daughters as concubines under certain conditions. Abraham, Solomon, and David, all key figures in Judeo-Christian traditions, had concubines. If concubinage is inherently evil, why is it present in these faiths? Many Hindu rulers, from the Mauryan Empire to the Mughals, kept concubines. Yet these aspects are often ignored in favor of attacking Islam. Here's the reality. Critics don't care about slavery or concubinage. If they did, they'd criticize their own traditions first. Instead, their goal is to attack Islam, not uphold moral consistency. So here's a challenge. If someone criticizes Islam for these practices, ask them, does your faith have a clean record? If they ignore their own history, they aren't debating in good faith. Unlike other traditions, Islam reformed slavery and concubinage. It gave slaves rights, dignity, and an easy path to freedom. It set strict guidelines against abuse. It encouraged their liberation. While other civilizations treated concubines as disposable objects, Islam integrated them into society with honor. So the next time someone tries to use slavery or concubinage as a weapon against Islam, remind them, history is bigger than cherry-picked arguments. If you want to talk about morality, let's be fair. As we conclude this discussion, it's important to reflect on how Islam's principles sought to elevate humanity, even in practices like slavery and concubinage. These systems were not ideal by today's standards, but they were designed to reform and eventually phase out exploitation. But the conversation doesn't end here. Islam's rich history is full of inspiring figures and untold stories. One such story is that of Bilal ibn Rabah, a former slave who rose to become one of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad. His journey from oppression to honor is a testament to Islam's transformative power.